Oliver Morton is an award-winning science writer and editor, author of multiple books, including most recently 2019's The Moon, A History for the Future. He works on the Economist to a lesser degree podcast on climate change and contributed to the Economist's latest special report, Stabilising the Climate. Oliver, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Very nice to be here, Brock.
It's great to have you on. You know, the why now of the special report, it's pretty easy to see. We've got COP26 coming up just around the corner. This has been something we have been focused on all year, but I'm curious, you know, you're working with this group that's working on this special report. What did you want to accomplish putting out this report right before COP26?
We wanted to accomplish something like a big dramatic pull back. We didn't want to dive into the COP because we do a lot of climate coverage in The Economist. It's something we pride ourselves on. And we've covered all sorts of aspects of things going into COP, and we will be covering the COP and we will be digesting the COP. But in order to take the advantage of the time when people are really thinking about climate, what we wanted to do was pull back from the immediate and from whether or not it's make or break or do or die, and try and put this in the overarching context of probably the biggest, certainly the biggest concerted action in human history, an attempt to stabilize the climate. Humans as a group have never tried to do such a thing before. Possibly the most momentous change since the Industrial Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution, depending on how you like. I mean, and by putting it in that context, you see quite how extraordinary a commitment climate stabilization is, because basically the climate is stable from early history all the way through to 1850. And then suddenly it takes this sharp left turn and the CO2 level goes straight up and the climate level starts to rise after it. And so the question of when we come out of that climb and where we go after that, that's a huge change. And it will be, and the difference between that and the Industrial Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution is that to some extent, and whenever this comes, and I'm fully aware that it may come far later than we would wish, this will be a change that has been made to some extent with foresight. Mm-hmm. This is a change of humans as a group making decisions in very imperfect worldwide decision-making processes and deciding that they need to do this. And that large context gets lost when we're just all worried about China's NDCs, or whether John Kerry will walk naked into the climate into the negotiating chamber because there are no credible American pledges. That's all interesting stuff. But we wanted to pull back and look at the big issues of why this had happened, where we have to focus now, and what we do about stabilizing the climate once we've got rid of current emissions.
And when you look back, when you do pull back and you think about where world leaders were at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, so much has changed, which is detailed in the report itself. And I think that's kind of amusing to think about world leaders in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. And this is mentioned in the report. The level of ambition may not, I wonder how much people were sort of thinking about how ambitious this of an undertaking this is going to be. In the report, it states, in 1992, when the CO2 levels had reached 356 parts per million and evidence of anthropogenic warming was, if not overwhelming, definitely discernible, the leaders of the world agreed to do something about the potentially catastrophic course they had more or less unwillingly embarked on, unquote. This is the 26th COP. When you look back at the work that has been done by world leaders, what strikes you about what they've accomplished or what they haven't accomplished in these meetings now that we're on to the 26th COP?
Well, I think what it makes me think of really strongly is something that F. Scott Fitzgerald says in The Crack Up, which is that the mark of a refined mind is being able to hold two opposing opinions at the same time. And so part of me thinks, oh my God, it's taking so long. And part of me thinks it's kind of remarkable to do this in 30 years. And I think you can justify both of those things, but there is not a world government. most people in the world don't want a world government. So you can't just tell someone who's in charge of the world to go and get it done. So you do have to come to work with the institutions that we have, and the UN institutions, far from ideal, are the institutions we have. And you can build on top of what the UN institutions do. No one, I think, should feel that their climate ambition should be limited by the UNFCCC. But the fact that you can get along further and, you know, even pull along the people who really don't very much want climate action, so for instance, large petrostates, or the people who have a very different view of global equity, like for instance, the Bolivians, the fact that those people can all be brought along, it's incredibly tiresome, but at the same time, it's kind of remarkable. It's what Wayward talked about. It's the slow boring of hard bores. It takes time. The problem is, and the reason why I don't just sort of like put on my Pollyanna hat and say, wow, they're doing something amazing, is that time is actually geophysically constrained. Mm-hmm. You know, we do not have infinite amounts of time. We do not have enough time. The amount of time left to actually do the reductions is terrifyingly short. So I think it's a like really cosmic version of half full, half empty there, Brock.
And a big part of, you know, where we end up with what warming we end up reaching is how quickly we scale, you know, zero carbon energy sources, right? And obviously in this special report, you're looking at the economics of clean energy in 2021. When you pull back and look at it, what are the realities that world leaders face in 2021 with the economics of clean energy, and how has that kind of changed in some of the past COPs?
Well, it's the biggest change in that I did a piece earlier this year about the fall in the price of solar photovoltaics, solar panels, and there's really just nothing like it. And so when I started writing about the climate and the zeros, actually I started earlier than that, but okay, going back to the zeros, you know, solar power just looked ludicrously expensive, and there was a widespread belief, notably in Silicon Valley, that in order for solar power to get really cheap, you'd have to have a whole new technology. And no, it turned out that just buying them in bulk and then more bulk and then more bulk brought the prices down pretty effectively. It didn't do everything that the people who were behind the policy wanted. So for instance, the Germans, who really drove this process in the zeros, thought that they'd bring a solar power manufacturing industry to Germany. And yeah, that didn't happen. That industry is in China. And they thought that they'd get lots of nice little solar power on rooftops. And they got a lot of that, but they also got great big farms of solar panels. So it doesn't come out quite as they expected. But the fact is that both solar and wind, and now increasingly offshore wind, are genuinely cheap ways of producing power. And that means that it's sort of like you've got the runway now. You can really see how you can get renewable energy into, you know, sort of like a third, then a half, then more than a half of the whole electricity mix. And you can also see that electricity is going to be powering more and more of the things that we do. And that's great, because electricity is like this sort of like arbitrage system whereby it doesn't matter where the energy comes from, if it comes out the plug, you're happy. Now, there's an awful lot of work to be done on the grid to make sure it comes out of the plug. But basically, it's not like everyone's adapted for most purposes, it's not like everyone's adapted to using steam engines and has to stop using steam engines. Everyone uses electricity and they can still use electricity. So the reality is that the biggest change, I think, in the overall scheme of things, is that you now really can say that it is possible to drive the role of fossil fuels in the grid really low, and possibly, if you're willing to use significant amounts of nuclear or hydrogen storage or something like that, maybe get rid of them altogether.
And, you know, even if we solve the energy problem, there's more to do than just that. But in addition to that, as you mentioned earlier, this is a question of time. How quickly are we going to limit warming? And in Paris, obviously, the 1.5 to stay alive for many low-lying nations, this is a goal. Like, how do we stay at 1.5 degrees Celsius and certainly not exceed 2 degrees Celsius? What's the state? What is the reality of limiting warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius?
I think limiting warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius is, broadly speaking, not possible now with emissions reduction alone. You have to either build in a lot of negative emissions where you put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's kind of weird. You put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then you take it out immediately and you hope the planet didn't really notice. And funnily enough, the planet doesn't really notice as long as the stuff doesn't stay up there too long. Or alternatively, you might look at more radical ideas like solar geoengineering, but just through emissions reduction, 1.5 has more or less sailed by Paris, maybe more or less sailed by Copenhagen. So you have to be looking at extra stuff for 1.5. You will need to do some drawing out of the atmosphere even to hit 2, almost certainly, but not to the same extent. I mean, the amount of emissions that are still allowable on a 2-degree budget is significantly greater than 1.5, almost more than twice as large.
This report goes deep into emissions in Asia, obviously, where in 2021, where the countries with the largest emission sources. China plans to go net zero by 2060. They've announced that. How reasonable do you think it is to expect China to actually be on pace for that goal?
Okay, if you'd asked me in 1980 what I expected of China in 2020, I can not tell you what the answer would have been, but I can tell you that the answer would have been wrong. So I think making predictions about what China will actually achieve over the next 40 years, you can say that smart people can put forward technologically coherent pathways by which that might happen. And you can say that the Chinese government contains a lot more engineering savvy than most governments do, and that it takes a long view, partly for self-preservation purposes. But also you have to bear in mind that it's an oppressive, authoritarian government, and that might actually not be the best way to get things done. I sincerely hope and believe that it's not the best way to get things done, and that it's subject to its own instabilities. And to think that just because President Xi says something will happen, it will happen, is to misunderstand the nature of his power. Maybe not to overestimate, but to misunderstand it, because there are levels, there are ways in which coherent views have to be formed throughout the system. So could China do that? There's no reason in the laws of thermodynamics it couldn't, but what the Chinese economy and Chinese politics will look like over the next 40 years, that's really hard to say.
Yeah, and they obviously in the report you look into India as well, noting that similar paths can be mapped for India, but that country has yet to set an actual net zero target. When you look at the sort of the political landscape in India, what might you expect for decades to come as well, or is that just too hard to predict?
Well, I don't know. The Indians have been pretty consistent about resisting the idea of phasing out fossil fuels completely. They've long over a long period of time, they've said that there must be room for our carbon in the atmosphere just as there was room for your carbon. And if that's a problem for you, you have to do something about your share of the carbon budget, because we aren't committed to reducing ours. And that seems to be a pretty strongly held view in, at least amongst some in Indian policy circles. And I didn't write that part of the report, and I'm not an expert on Indian policy, but I'm told this from many points of view. So I do think that in some ways, India is the really big economy about which I think there's still so much to play for. I mean, although we don't know how China will actually do it, we do know that China is very likely to peak in its carbon dioxide emissions before it says it will. It may be giving itself slightly lowballing things to give itself some room for maneuver or to impress people. India, I don't see at the moment that it's likely to peak in the near future. And that's a worry, because it's growing very fast and it grows largely through coal.
Clean air is such a big part of the conversation on decarbonization, right? It just seems like, and the pressing for reducing all the premature deaths and disease that is being caused from polluted air is one of the driving motivators for climate action in 2021. And I'm just curious, it seems to me like we are watching the cost of clean energy plummet, while more and more studies are noticing the enormous costs that we have as a result of breathing horrible, dirty air. I'm wondering how you think just that knowledge and that acceleration of what we're understanding with polluted air, how that might impact what world leaders do on climate in the coming years.
Well, I think it's certainly, I mean, in terms of pressure from their populations, people in Indonesia or India are much more worried about clean air than they are about low carbon emissions. And we've already seen that in China, that the air in China has cleaned up a great deal. Still not great, but it's cleaned up a great deal. So I think that is going to drive, certainly that's going to drive a move away from using coal near large population centers. But there's one nasty irony of the way the Earth works that you need to remember here, which is that when you burn coal, you produce both carbon dioxide and soot and particles that damage the lungs. But some of those particles also reflect back sunlight. So if you take coal out of the mix, you long-term reduce warming, but in the short term, you have a slight increasing effect. And some people have suggested, Jim Hansen has suggested this, that we may be seeing some of that effect, that as sulfur emissions have been drastically reduced in developing countries, they were reduced in developed countries earlier, that you may already be seeing some amount of unmasking of warming that's already there. So that's a definite worry to take, but that is in no way a justification for keeping burning coal.
Let's shift gears here a little bit. The conversation on capitalism and climate change, obviously in this special report, and in the report that since the Paris Agreement, the degrowth movement has become more popular. How do you think the degrowth movement could actually influence actual international politics?
I think it's pretty unlikely to influence international politics. I think it might make an influence in some places nationally, but it's really hard, leaving aside the question of whether it's a good idea in general. It's a very hard thing to bring about. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to get people to vote for a stagnant standard of living. That's not something that it's easy to put on stump. Now you might be able to do it, but it's pretty hard to imagine you could do it for decades to come. And there's obviously a level of ethical concern here that has to be taken seriously. But at the same time, it's not clear that, it's not, when I say it's not clear, the developing world is not going to stop wanting to develop. Mm-hmm. And it's not going to, and one of the great motors of developing world development in the last 20 years has been Western world demand, developed world demand, and developed world investment. And in a zero growth economy, those things fall away. And so for a capitalist newspaper like The Economist, it's pretty clear that growth is the way out. And at the same time, I know that you will hear a lot of people saying you can't solve a problem with the same mindset as you created the problem. And in the end, leaving all questions of morality and ideology aside, I think that's basically an empirical question, because I don't think we're going to give up growth. So I think that the strong message is you've got to try and make that work. And I think there are good reasons to think, very good reasons to think, that growth makes it easier to tackle these things.
Do you anticipate, at least in industrialized nations, that there might be a rhetorical shift on the way major politicians talk about capitalism in the future when it comes to climate?
No, I think the thing that's going to drive the way that the developed world politicians talk about capitalism is much more likely to be long-term inequality, lack of social mobility, that sort of thing. I can't see developed world politicians really blaming capitalism for the climate. They will see it as an instrumental problem to be solved. If capitalism comes under serious question, I don't think it will be through this, but that's what I say in 2021. You want to come back in 2041, we'll talk again.
Let's talk about negative emissions and the economics of negative emissions. In the report, it states, quote, once you need to remove more CO2 than is being put in, an insufficient number of polluters make things trickier, unquote. Why is that the case, that the economics of negative emissions are a little bit trickier?
The idea is that while you have people putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, you can imagine ways to require them for taking an equivalent amount out of the atmosphere. So if there's something that is really, really hard to decarbonize, it might make more sense to take the carbon back down rather than not put it up in the first place. And that's basically what people are talking about when they talk about a net zero economy. The problem with net negative is that if you're actually just trying to take down carbon dioxide that's already up there, regardless of who put it there, then you have a real problem with working out who to send the bill to. Now, there are some companies, I think the report mentions Microsoft and IKEA, who've made a commitment to take down all the carbon dioxide that they've ever put up there. But I think it's very unlikely that you'll find all companies doing that on a voluntary basis. I also think it's unlikely that you'll find countries willing to do that on a voluntary basis. But at the same time, there will be pressure, certainly from developing countries, and we talked about the way that this feeds into the Indian view before. There will be pressure from developing countries that if room has to be made for more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then it's the developed countries that should suck it out. And that, I think, in the long run, I mean, it would be a problem that would be nice to have. A net zero world is better than a world where emissions are still very much non-zero. But when you come to, if you want any chance of 1.5, you have to start thinking about pulling down, going net negative, not net zero, net, the carbon dioxide level being lower each year rather than just staying the same. And it's very hard to see who would pay for that. I mean, it will get a lot easier if it turns out to be cheap to pull out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And there's no technological reason why that might not happen. But at the moment, it's a very expensive undertaking to do it through technology. And if you do it through encouraging the growth of plants, you do run into the problem that you need an awful lot of land, and a lot of the land that you might need might already be being used for other purposes. That's not always a terrible problem, but it is an issue.
Yeah, you mentioned Microsoft and IKEA. As you said, they're committing to pull down all their emissions. There's so much corporate influence at COP. A lot of companies are there. How seriously do you take the commitments that corporations are making? Do you think that this could be a kind of an influential thing, and how quickly we reduce or stop emissions?
I think to some extent it's an indicator of elite attitudes. To a large extent, I think it shows what corporations think they should be doing in order to look like good corporations. And I think that's a very reasonable strategy for some corporations to take. And I'm not in any way denying the possibility that some of this may be entirely sincere. And it's actually very hard not to think that the commitments that cost real money aren't sincere. To another extent, you might say that they are thinking that they're going to be regulated or carbon priced into these sort of moves anyway, and why not get some good PR out of doing them early and have to do them less rapidly. And that's a reading that my colleague on to a lesser degree, the host of the show, Vijay Vaitaswaran, I think Vijay basically believes that. The problem is that voluntary action, whether by corporations or by individuals, while possibly helpful to some extent, and corporations can do a lot more than individuals, doesn't give you the wholesale system change, because although some people may volunteer, a bunch of people may not. And it's really hard to imagine a purely voluntary system sort of like running up to sort of like 70, 80% approval. I mean, there's not much in the world that does that, right? So however game the companies are, and it's really important that companies are very good at innovating in some ways. However much the companies talk about things, you've got to, at some level, also have real government action. The companies can help bring that about, and they can use it to try and sort of like suppress their competitors who are less innovative than they are, and if that works for them and it gets us towards the sort of world that I want to see, then okay, cool.
Yeah. You mentioned, switching gears, you mentioned solar engineering, geoengineering earlier. We do not have time to get into all the nuances of solar geoengineering in the special report. You guys do a great job of kind of laying out the stakes and the complicated nature of solar geoengineering, both with the politics and the science behind it. But I'm just curious, one of the things we've been getting into this a lot on the show with solar engineering, geoengineering as late, and you've written a lot about this. When I look at this, I know the politics are different than reducing and eliminating emissions. But when I think about reducing and eliminating emissions on an international scale, it does, in my opinion, kind of seem like a dress rehearsal for how, if we did solar geoengineering, how that might go. If we can't come to good agreements on how we're going to actually eliminate emissions, how do we think that solar engineering is going to go any better?
That's, you put your finger on one of the many key points here. And if you want to have me back on just to talk about solar geoengineering, I'm all yours, Bob. But to answer that specific question, both to some people the potential and to many people the alarm about solar geoengineering is you don't need to come to an agreement. As long as enough people, enough countries want to do it, and no other countries object to the extent of, really strong, object in a way that really makes a difference to people, i.e. war and stuff like that. It can be done by a small group of countries, or at the limit, one country. And that's why that's why it's not a dress rehearsal. In some ways, one of the things that's dangerous about solar geoengineering is that it feels like a shortcut. And in fact, it's not a shortcut, because in fact, it lengthens the amount of time you have to spend actively messing around with the climate, because you have to do it for quite a long time, and you have to work out how to build it down. You have to decide what temperature you're at. It's a nightmare from that point of view, but it looks like a shortcut. And that might be something that will increasingly look attractive, and it only has to attract some people, not everyone. That's the difference between those changes I was talking about, which have to go to completion. Solar geoengineering doesn't need to do that. So that's why we wanted to put it into this special report, and also to draw out the similarities between net negative emissions and solar geoengineering, in that they're both technologies that don't really exist. And though negative emissions are being built, but they don't really exist at scale. And they're both ways of decoupling the climate from what we're currently emitting. And while that's in some ways that sounds good, because the climate at the moment is a real problem, and decoupling it from cumulative emissions sounds very appealing. But making sure that it stays decoupled, and that the way that it's decoupled works for as many people as possible. These are doing solar geoengineering well, probably is about as difficult as anything else, but doing it badly is disturbingly easy, I'd say.
Oh, absolutely. So just to wrap up here, in the report, it states, quote, Glasgow will show the degree to which national governments are able to deliver progress in terms of the increased ambition of their nationally determined contributions, the realization of long promised transfers of money from north to south, and workable rules for the parts of the Paris Agreement which remain sketchy, unquote. Obviously, this special report is a pullback. It does take the long view, but I'm curious, as you are going to watch COP26 unfold over the next couple of weeks, what are you going to be watching for?
Well, the British government is talking about cash, coal, cars, and trees. And that's a bit slick, but it's not the worst way to think it. I mean, the most important thing in terms of building a foundation on which other things will happen is for the promised financial flows from north to south to actually be realized. And that's, I mean, without that show of good faith, I think that things will go very badly. We'll see big debates about loss and damage, and that's a subject which matters a lot in specifically some developing countries, but I think it matters in developing countries in general. And that's sort of like, that's different from aid for adaptation and mitigation. That's sort of like saying, you've done this, you need to do something about having done this. We'll see. I'm not particularly moved about the work on carbon markets. It may matter, it may not. I mean, the worst thing to happen would be to get a badly designed international carbon market system working, because I think that would be very hard to undo. And I think that what was called the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol was not, I don't think anyone would think that was a success. I'd love to see some sort of like particular announcement on coal. I think that's the next pressure point. So it's not like Glasgow's not going to produce, sort of like, I don't think it's going to produce anything like the Glasgow Agreement or the Glasgow Protocol. It's meant to be a turning of the ratchet, in which things get tighter, things that were loose at Paris get tightened. And I think it might manage that to some extent, but it's not going to suddenly put the world on a nice free downhill ride to 1.5 degrees Celsius. One of the reasons of going back to the long view and sort of like starting out with things about, where the carbon dioxide level was when the Prophet Muhammad first spoke to the faithful, is that these are big historic changes. This is something that's going to outlast me and you, and this is the context of so much else that's going to go on. It's never going to be reducible to one thing, and yet at the same time, all the time, it feels terribly urgent. It's another of those sort of like terrible contradictions of the thing. It's so big that you think that it has a timescale in centuries, and yet action now is urgent. And COP will try and, the people trying to make a difference at COP will try and do something about that. And some people will try to obstruct them, and the rest of us will, get on the popcorn and watch.
Well, if you want that long view, you can get a great one again with the Economist's latest special report, Stabilising the Climate, which Oliver is a contributor to. And you can follow Oliver at Eater of Sun on Twitter. Oliver Morton, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
Really enjoyed it, Rob. Thanks a lot for having me.